Okay, so module 29, the market for loanable funds. Again, another extremely important graph. This one, has proved to be tricky in the past. It's a little bit trickier than money market. But again, at the core, it's just a supply and demand graph. We're talking about the supply of money available for lending and the demand for money available for lending. So here is the graph. We have the interest rate. Now, this graph is actually the real interest rate, which we'll get into a little bit later, and then the quantity of loanable funds. And then we have the upward sloping supply curve, supply of loanable funds, and the downward sloping demand curve, which is the demand for loanable funds. And you can see our equilibrium interest rate is 8%. And what this tells us is if you are trying to start a project and you believe that your rate of return is going to be higher than 8%, right, you're going to want to get that project funded. And if you are not going to make that, your offer is not going to be funded, okay? And so that's basically the gist of what the loanable funds graph is telling us, right? Projects that aren't going to make that 8%, there's no sense in funding them because you're not going to make your money back. And if it's more, you will make your money back. So let's look at the market for loanable funds. Again, this brings together borrowers and savers of money. Now, primarily, who borrows money? Well, there's three groups: consumers, businesses, and the government borrow money from our loanable funds market. And so the loanable funds market explains how these groups interact with each other. So the equilibrium interest rate is the real interest rate, because when you borrow money or are going to be paid back money, you want to know what your real returns are going to be, right? I could be making 20%, but if inflation is 20%, that interest rate is not very helpful to me, right? I want to know what my real returns are. And so in order to get my real returns, I need to understand what the inflation is going to be. And so the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus what inflation is expected to be, or expected inflation. And if expected inflation is zero, then we're going to have a real interest rate that equals the nominal interest rate. So let's look at what makes up the demand for loanable funds and makes up the supply of loanable funds. The demand for loanable funds is made up of people that like to borrow money. They demand more loanable funds. What are the things that affect the demand for loanable funds? Well, the first thing is businesses. They borrow money to pay for capital. I want to buy a tractor. I want to buy a pizza oven. I want to buy a new storefront, whatever. Okay? So businesses borrow funds for capital projects. Again, as I said before, if the expected rate of return on this project exceeds the real interest rate, that makes it a profitable investment, and I will demand those funds. If not, it doesn't make sense for me to borrow money. Government can also borrow loanable funds, and we'll talk about that, what causes government, and individuals can borrow money too for houses, cars, and so on. Now, as you see in there, the real interest rate falls, projects become profitable, and the quantity of funds demanded will increase. And so just like all of our downward sloping curves, at a lower real interest rate, we have a higher demand for funds. And remember, interest rate is the price of money. So if you don't think about it as an interest rate, which is a relatively foreign term, think about it as the price of money. At a lower price of money, I'm going to want more of it. The supply of loanable funds is a little bit different. Supply of loanable funds is made up of savers, people who are saving money, okay? If I'm going to put my money in the bank, right, if I'm going to lend my money out, I can't be spending that money. And so if I'm going to save and lend money, I have to be sacrificing things that I could be buying at this point. Now, what determines that? Well, I must receive a higher real interest rate, Okay, and so there are the dogs, and so as the real interest rate goes up, I have a better chance of getting a higher return on my money, so I'm going to be willing to put it in the bank and less likely to keep it in my hands because I'm foregoing a lot if I keep it on me when I could be earning a higher real interest rate. And so you can see as the real interest rate rises, the quantity of loanable funds will increase. At higher real interest rates, more people are willing to save their money. All right, so here is the market for loanable funds. You see, you have the real interest rate, you have the quantity of loans, you have the upward sloping supply curve, and the downward sloping demand curve. Let's look at a scenario. The government increases deficit spending. This is one of the most common instances of government borrowing. Okay, what is deficit spending? Deficit spending is when the government is spending money, but they're not raising tax revenues to cover their expenses. So, for example, textbook expansionary fiscal policy. What do? You increase government spending and you lower taxes. Well, how do you spend money that you're not raising? You borrow it. And where do you go to borrow it? You go to the loanable funds market. So what happens if the government increases deficit spending? Well, they borrow from the private sector. If you're a bank, if you're a lender, would you rather loan your money to the government, businesses, or individuals? Well, you want to loan to the government, right? They have a 100% repayment rate. The government has never defaulted on one of their debts. So here's what happens. Government borrows, that increases the demand for loanable funds. So our loanable funds demand curve is going to shift to the right. What does this do? It increases the real interest rate. With both this graph and the money market graph, we are mostly concerned with the vertical axis. We want to know what's happening with the interest rate. And so here you can see the real interest rate is going up. This causes something known as crowding out. At a higher real interest rate, and again, that's a higher price of money, are businesses going to want to borrow? No. Are consumers going to want to borrow? No. And so the fact that the government borrows money, raising the real interest rate, that crowds out private investment because the government, the public sector, is demanding that money. We'll talk more about this, but this is sort of the most common instance of loanable funds. We see this example more than almost any other one. So let's look at what shifts each of the curves in the loanable funds market. First, demand. Well, changes in perceived business opportunities. If I think that I have a great business opportunity that's going to make me a lot of money, I'm going to demand more loanable funds. If I think my chances are not very good or something bad's happening, I'm going to demand less. Changes in government borrowing, right? As I said, deficit spending, right? That will cause governments to borrow money. If a government were to run a budget surplus, that would decrease the demand for loanable funds because they have extra money. There's no need to borrow it if they have it on hand. The things that shift the supply of loanable funds. Changes in private sector savings behavior, right? Maybe households, all of a sudden start feeling nervous and they start wanting to put money away. Or maybe they feel prices are going to rise, so they start spending now so they don't have to spend later, right? That will shift the supply of loanable funds, how much we as individuals decide to save. Changes in public savings, right? The government, if their government decides to put money off to the side or spend money as well. Changes in foreign investment. When foreign money comes into the country, this is an idea we'll see later in Unit 7. When foreign money comes into our country, it finds its way to the loanable funds market. Foreign investors, right? They think that the real interest rates are higher in the United States. They want to put their money here as opposed to their country. So that would increase the supply of loanable funds. And then finally, again, changes in expected profitability, right? If I think profits are going to go up, I'm not going to need to save as much money. I'm going to be able to not invest, and I'll be able to stock more money away. And so supply will go up. Now, let's talk about nominal versus real interest rates. All right, another very important idea. And here we have interest rates and inflation. What are interest rates? Why do lenders charge them? Well, the idea is that interest rates being the price of money, if I'm going to lend you money, I'm going to want something for that, right? So, would you be willing to lend me $100 if I said I was going to pay you an interest rate of 100%? So you give me $100 today, and at some point I give you $200. That sounds great, but what if I plan to pay you back in 20-something years? Is that still a good investment? No, probably not. If the nominal interest rate is 10% and the inflation rate is 15%, what's the real interest rate? Well, we just kind of talked about this a minute ago, right? I'm charging you 10%, but prices are going up by 15%, right? So what's really happening? All right, well, let's look at how we figure this out. Okay, real interest rates are the percentage interest rate that's adjusted for inflation, right? So what happens to my purchasing power with that new money? Okay, so in the example I just gave you, what's happening? I'm paying you back 10%, but really you're losing 5%, right? So the nominal interest rate is not great, and the real interest rate is -5, right? So 10% sounds good, but not when you factor in inflation. And then the nominal interest rate, well, there's the equation, real equals nominal minus inflation. And then we have the nominal interest rate. This is the percentage increase in money that the borrower pays when you don't adjust for inflation, okay? And the formula here is real interest rate plus inflation, okay? And that will get you the nominal interest rate. And we'll talk a little bit about this later on. And now, if I'm right, this was my favorite meme from last year. Some of you might remember Kevin Durant's MVP speech. If not, go find a video of it. But nominal interest rate minus inflation rate, you to real interest rate. Go look it up. It was my favorite. I love it. Best one ever. Here we are again. Let's look at some examples. You lend out $100 with 20% interest and 15% inflation. A year later, you get paid back $120. What's the nominal and what's the real interest rate? Nominal interest rate is 20%. Real interest rate was 5%. 20% nominal, take out inflation, and your real return, what your purchasing power is with the money you got back, was 5%. Right? So you got paid back better than your original 100, right? But less than what you would have gotten, not $120 worth of purchasing power. Second example, you lend out $100 with a 10% interest rate. Prices are expected to increase 20%, and when you get paid back $110. What is the real and what is the nominal interest rate? Well, the nominal interest rate is 10%, just the interest rate, and the real interest rate is -10%. You actually lost money on that transaction, okay? So you got paid back an amount with less purchasing power. So what's the relationship between interest rates and bond prices? This is something that we're going to talk about. And there's a bottom line to this. That's all you need to know. I'll give you a couple different ways of understanding it, hopefully. So bonds are things that you can buy. They're used to finance sport projects, athletic projects, stadiums. They're used to finance the school rebuilding projects, okay? And so you can wait for them to mature, or you can sell them off early if you need the money. So if you bought a bond, this is different than putting it into the bank. Assume you bought a bond at a 5% interest rate that will mature in 10 years, okay? So you're going to make 5% a year over the course of 10 years. What happens if the interest rates in the banks go to 10%? Will buyers be more or less interested in buying your bond? Would you rather buy something at 5% return or 10% return? You'd probably be more willing to buy something at a 10% return, right? As the interest rate goes up, right, bond prices need to go down to make them more attractive to buyers, right? No one would ever buy this bond at its regular price because they can get a bigger return putting it in the bank, okay? And so as people are less interested in something, the price is going to decrease. Now, what's the bottom line? For many of you, this is what you're going to be happy with. Interest rates and bond prices are inversely related. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. When interest rates go down, bond prices go up. And there's another way that I can explain this to you. I'll probably do that in class. But here's the bottom line. Inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. Again, make sure you save any questions for me tomorrow. And that's it.